My wife makes my son wear a booster seat. He's 16. My son Chris was born prematurely and spent weeks on a ventilator, so it made sense that my wife Diana treated him like glass. But even as he got older, stronger, healthier, she wouldn't let him do anything by himself. She'd cut his food for him, walk him to class, make him wear a bright yellow hard hat everywhere, even feed him breast milk to help him grow strong until he's 25. Chris never complained about any of it, except for the booster seat. Chris was 16 and still sitting in booster seats meant for toddlers. Every time we went anywhere, he had to use it. Didn't matter if we were going on a road trip or just driving to the grocery store. Diana insisted it was safer for teens, that the regular seatbelt didn't fit him right anyway, but I knew this was wrong. Last Tuesday, when I picked him up from school, he confessed, "Dad, everyone's calling me Baby Chris because of the booster seat. Can't you convince Mom to stop this, please?" I'd tried talking to Diana before, multiple times, but she'd always say I didn't care about Chris's safety, that anything that happened would be my fault. But the expression he wore now made something snap. When we got home, I pulled the booster seat from the car and carried it straight to the trash bin outside. Diana stood by the doorway, her face pale as she screamed, "What are you doing?" She marched down the driveway and grabbed my arm, trying to stop me, something I should have done years ago. "I'm throwing this out," I told her. "Put it back." I shook my head. "No, he's 16. He's being bullied at school. Poor kid hasn't had a friend come over in years. It all ends now." The next morning, while Diana was at book club, I called Chris down to the kitchen. I threw him an apron and grinned. "I'm going to teach you how to cook and learn everything you were supposed to learn by now." Chris blinked at me like I'd lost it. "Dad, if Mom finds out, she might actually divorce you. Then we won't let her find out. Come on." I started with scrambled eggs. Simple, hard to mess up. Except Chris did mess up. He cranked the heat too high and the eggs burned to the pan. Smoke started filling the kitchen. "Oh no, oh no, oh no." Chris grabbed the pan and burned his hand on the handle. He dropped it and it clattered onto the floor. "It's okay. Run your hand under cold water." "I'll handle this," I said gently. I opened all the windows, cleaned up the mess, and we tried again. This time with the heat lower. We later moved on to laundry, then basic home repairs, first aid, finance, even basic emergency protocols. Most importantly, he learned to fail, make mistakes, and get back up. And my wife never had to know. Or so I thought. Diana and I were driving home from dinner when a car rammed into us from the wrong side of the road. I barely had time to say Diana's name before our car skidded off and everything went dark. I woke up in the hospital with Chris beside me. The doctor explained Diana had 2 broken legs, and I had a fractured spine and broken arm. We'd both be bedridden for 6 to 8 weeks. Diana immediately started panicking, but before she could say anything, Chris started taking charge, handling things with the doctors. Once home, Chris got us into our beds, then disappeared downstairs. He came back with grilled cheese and soup. Diana stared at her plate, too shocked to speak. Over the next few days, he handled everything. Laundry, dinner, medications, all organized and on time. Then one morning, a couple weeks into recovery when we could finally move around a bit, Diana watched him in the kitchen and finally asked, "Chris, how do you know how to do all of this?" "I figured it out, Mom," he lied. "No." Her voice cracked. "You didn't just figure this out. Someone taught you." She turned to me with a hurt expression. Chris put down the kitchen knife on the cutting board. "Dad's been teaching me. For months," he admitted. "You went behind my back?" Diana's voice was barely a whisper. "He could cut himself or burn something or worse. How could you?" She screamed. That's when Chris picked the knife back up and started chopping again. 2 seconds later, he sliced his finger. Blood dripped onto the cutting board. Diana screamed, but Chris just casually walked to the sink, rinsed it under cold water, grabbed a paper towel, and applied pressure. He opened the first aid kit with his free hand, pulled out a bandage, and wrapped it properly. Then he went right back to cooking like nothing happened. "See, Mom? I'm okay. I can handle it. I'm not a kid anymore." Diana covered her face with her hands and cried. I'm sorry. I never got to be a kid growing up, Chris. My parents were monsters. I was only 8 when I had to learn to care for myself. Cook meals, laundry, dishes, enroll myself in school. I just didn't want you to grow up until you were ready. Over the next week, it felt like we were finally becoming the family we should have been all along. Then the phone rang one morning. Diana looked at the caller ID and went pale. Her hands shook as she answered the phone. "Mom? Dad?" she asked. Chris's eyes grew wide. It was them, the monster parents. They were coming here, tonight. Diana sat frozen on the couch, staring at nothing while I tried to wrap my head around what this visit would mean for us. Chris walked over from the kitchen and asked how long they planned to stay. Diana whispered the word week like she was telling us someone had died. I caught Chris's eye across the room and saw the same worry I felt sitting heavy in my chest. We'd spent months building Diana up, helping her see that Chris could handle things, and now her parents could tear all that progress down in just a few days. Diana started explaining in this shaky voice that her parents heard about the accident through some distant relative we barely talked to anymore. They insisted on coming to help take care of things since we were both still recovering. I watched her hands tremble as she picked at the blanket covering her lap, pulling at loose threads like she wanted to unravel the whole thing. Chris moved closer and quietly asked if they knew about his new skills, about all the cooking and cleaning he'd been doing. Diana shook her head fast and said they absolutely could not find out because they'd blame her for being a bad mother, for putting him in danger, for failing to protect him properly. I spent the whole afternoon trying to calm Diana down while Chris made dinner in the kitchen, but she kept spiraling deeper into panic about what her parents would say and do when they got here. She told us stories I'd never heard before in all our years of marriage. Being left completely alone for days when she was only 8 years old, learning to cook on a tiny hot plate because there was no one to teach her how to use the real stove safely, wearing the same dirty clothes to the school for weeks because no one showed her how to do laundry or even told her it needed doing. Chris stood in the doorway listening with his eyes getting wider and wider, finally understanding where his mother's fear actually came from. That evening, we scrambled around the house, hiding every bit of evidence of Chris's growing independence. He put away the cookbook he'd been using to plan meals. I hid the car keys I'd been teaching him with in my nightstand drawer. We even climbed up into the attic and brought down that old booster seat, the one I'd thrown away months ago, but Diana had secretly rescued and stored. Diana insisted everything needed to look exactly like she was still in complete control, still protecting Chris the way she always had, still keeping him safe from every possible danger. I hated the idea of lying and pretending, but I saw the pure terror in her eyes and agreed to play along for now. Chris stared at the booster seat sitting on the kitchen counter and protested that he thought we were finally past all this. Diana grabbed his hands and begged him to just get through this 1 week. She promised that once her parents left, things could go right back to how they'd been lately, with him cooking and helping and learning new skills every day. I walked over and squeezed his shoulder, catching his eye and mouthing the words, "Trust me," because I had absolutely no intention of letting Diana's parents undo months of real progress. We moved upstairs to set up the guest room with fresh sheets and towels when Diana suddenly started hyperventilating. She collapsed onto the bed crying that she couldn't do this, couldn't handle having them in her house. Chris ran to get her a glass of water and grabbed a paper bag from under the bathroom sink. I sat beside her holding her hand tight while we both tried to calm her down using the breathing techniques her doctor taught her. She sobbed about spending 18 years of her life trying to escape from them, and now they were coming right into her home, invading the one safe space she'd managed to build for herself. I suggested we set some ground rules before they arrived, like time limits on how long the visit would last, topics that were completely off limits for discussion, and real consequences if they crossed any boundaries we set. Diana looked at me like I'd just suggested we fly to the moon without a spaceship. She said her parents had never respected a single boundary in their entire lives, and they certainly wouldn't start now. Chris pointed out that she was a grown adult now with her own family, and she had every right to protect herself and protect us from people who treated her badly. Johnny and Regina Harrington pulled up in front of our house at exactly 7 o'clock in this huge luxury car that practically screamed, "Look how much money we have." I understood instantly why Diana had turned out the way she did, why she was so scared and anxious all the time. Regina swept through our front door, already criticizing everything from the neighborhood we chose to live in to the furniture we'd picked out to the dinner Chris had nervously reheated for them. Johnny barely even looked at any of us, just walked straight to the living room and grabbed the TV remote, immediately demanding to know why we didn't have all the premium cable channels he wanted to watch. Within 10 minutes of walking through the door, Regina started firing questions at Diana about the accident. She asked why Diana wasn't being more careful on the road. She implied the whole thing could have been prevented if Diana had just paid better attention. Diana actually shrank into herself on the couch, stammering out apologies and explanations like a little kid being scolded by a teacher. I sat there watching my confident, loving wife completely disappear, and this terrified little girl took her place instead. Regina's eyes landed on Chris standing awkwardly by the kitchen doorway. She rushed over and started fussing over him in a way that felt way more possessive than actually loving. She pinched his cheeks hard enough to leave red marks and asked why he looked so thin and unhealthy. She turned back to Diana and demanded to know what exactly Diana had been feeding him all these years. She suggested pretty strongly that Diana clearly couldn't manage even the most basic parts of parenting. Chris politely pulled himself away from her grabbing hands and caught my eye with this look that told me he finally understood everything, that he finally got why his mom was the way she was. Regina insisted on inspecting the guest room before settling in, running her finger along the dresser and holding it up to show the dust she claimed was there, even though I'd cleaned it that afternoon. She complained about the water pressure being too weak when she tested the shower, then came back out saying the thread count on the sheets felt cheap against her skin. Johnny stood in the doorway listing everything wrong with the neighborhood, from the street noise to the lack of security cameras to the type of cars our neighbors drove. Diana apologized for each complaint, her voice getting quieter and smaller with every word, promising she'd get better sheets tomorrow and asking what thread count Regina preferred. Chris had reheated the lasagna he'd made earlier, but Johnny pushed his plate away after one bite and asked why we were serving leftovers to guests. Regina picked at her food and wondered aloud why we didn't have any fresh ingredients in the house, saying she would have expected better hospitality. Diana stammered something about the accident making shopping difficult, but Regina just sighed like Diana was making excuses for laziness. Johnny demanded to know what kind of scotch we had, and when I told him we only had beer and wine, he acted like I'd personally insulted him. He complained about having to sleep in a house with inadequate security, saying anyone could just walk right in through our flimsy locks. I watched my wife shrink further into the couch cushions with each criticism, apologizing for things that didn't need apologies, and I wanted to throw both of them out right then. But Diana's hand shook when she reached for her water glass, and I knew confronting them would only make things worse for her. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of crying coming from Diana's side of the bed. She was curled up facing away from me, her shoulders shaking as she tried to muffle the sounds. I touched her arm gently, and she flinched before turning toward me, her face wet with tears in the dim light from the hallway. She whispered that having them here brought back every terrible memory she'd spent years trying to forget, that she could hear her mother's voice criticizing her the same way Regina used to when Diana was little. She told me about being 8 years old and trying to cook rice on a hot plate because her parents hadn't come home in 2 days and she was hungry. She'd burned her hand badly on the metal edge, but there was no one to help her or take her to a doctor or even put a bandage on it properly. She'd wrapped it in a dirty towel and gone to the school the next day, with the burn getting infected, and when a teacher finally noticed and called her parents, Regina had yelled at Diana for being careless and making them look bad. I held Diana while she shook and cried into my chest, feeling this burning anger at these people who damaged my wife so badly and were now sleeping comfortably in our guest room. She whispered that she was sorry for being so overprotective with Chris, that she knew she'd gone too far, but the thought of him ever feeling scared and alone and hurt like she had been made her panic. I stroked her hair and promised we'd get through this week together, but inside I was plotting how to get her parents out of our house as fast as possible. The next morning I came downstairs to find Regina already in the kitchen, pulling containers out of the fridge and throwing them in the trash. Chris stood frozen by the doorway watching weeks of his carefully organized meal prep get tossed away like garbage. Regina had brought 3 bags of expensive ingredients and was unpacking them onto the counter, talking about how she'd be cooking proper meals for the family since Diana clearly couldn't manage it from the couch. Chris tried to explain that he'd been handling the cooking just fine, that he had a whole system set up, but Regina just smiled and patted his cheek. She said it was sweet that he tried to help, but now the adults would take care of things. I watched Chris's face go blank as his grandmother dismissed weeks of hard work and learning, throwing out the meal planning sheets he'd taped to the fridge and replacing them with her own handwritten menu. She pulled out all the pots and pans Chris had organized by size and started rearranging them according to her own preferences, talking the whole time about how young people today don't understand proper kitchen organization. Diana sat on the living room couch watching this happen, opening her mouth like she wanted to say something but no words coming out. Regina announced she'd be making eggs Benedict for breakfast, something fancy and complicated that would take hours, completely ignoring the simple breakfast sandwiches Chris had planned to make. Johnny settled into the living room recliner like he owned it, immediately grabbing the remote and flipping through channels while complaining about every single one. He demanded coffee, and I had to explain we only had a regular drip coffee maker, not the espresso machine he apparently needed. He asked for newspapers and seemed shocked that we didn't get physical papers delivered anymore, acting like reading news on a phone was somehow barbaric. He barely looked at Chris except to ask why a 16-year-old boy wasn't playing football or basketball or doing normal teenage things. Diana started to explain about Chris being born premature and having health concerns for years, but Johnny cut her off mid-sentence. He said she'd coddled Chris into weakness, that boys need to be tough and athletic, that all this staying home and helping his injured parents were making him soft. Chris stood there taking it silently, his jaw clenched tight, while Johnny went on about how his generation knew how to raise real men. Diana tried again to defend her parenting choices, but her voice came out small and uncertain, nothing like the confident mother I'd seen her become over the past few weeks. Johnny just shook his head and changed the channel, dismissing her completely. Regina went out to my car to get something from her bags and came back holding the booster seat we'd put back in yesterday. She walked into the living room carrying it like a trophy, praising Diana for finally doing something right by keeping Chris safe. Diana's face went completely pale as Regina launched into this long lecture about modern parenting being too permissive, about how children need strict control and constant supervision until they're at least 18. She said too many parents these days let their kids run wild without proper safety measures, and she was proud that Diana at least understood the importance of car seat safety. I saw Chris's jaw clench as he realized his grandmother actually thought the booster seat was a good idea, that she was praising the exact thing that had made his life miserable. Regina kept going, talking about how teenagers think they're invincible, but their bodies are still developing and need extra protection. She suggested Diana should also consider getting Chris a helmet to wear in the car, saying she'd read about it online and it made perfect sense. Diana just nodded and murmured agreement, and I watched my wife disappear further into the scared little girl her parents had created. During breakfast, Regina criticized everything about how Diana had raised Chris over the past 16 years. She said his clothes looked sloppy and asked why Diana let him wear such casual things instead of dressing him properly. She complained about his table manners, even though he was eating perfectly normally, saying he chewed too loudly and didn't sit up straight enough. She demanded to know what extracurricular activities he did, and when Diana explained he'd been focused on recovery and helping at home, Regina acted like this was proof of failed parenting. She went on about how Chris should be in debate club and student government and volunteering, building a resume for college applications. She criticized his posture, his haircut, the way he held his fork, even the fact that he was quiet during breakfast instead of making conversation. Diana took it all silently, nodding and apologizing and promising to do better, regressing further into the scared child she must have been. Chris pushed his food around his plate, looking between his mother and grandmother with this growing understanding and anger in his eyes. I could see him putting together all the pieces of why Diana had been so overprotective, why she'd tried so hard to give him everything and keep him safe from everything. Regina kept talking about all of Diana's failures as a parent, while Diana just sat there accepting every criticism like she deserved it. I found Chris in his room later that morning, sitting on his bed staring at the wall. He looked up when I came in and asked how his mom had survived growing up with these people, his voice quiet but intense. He said he'd always thought Diana was just overprotective for no reason, that she was being irrational and controlling, but now he understood she was trying to be the parent she never had. He said watching his grandmother tear his mom apart over breakfast made him see everything differently, made him realize every time Diana had held on too tight was because she remembered what it felt like when nobody held on at all. I sat down next to him and told him that understanding where someone's fear comes from doesn't mean accepting unhealthy behavior, but it does mean having compassion. I explained that Diana's overprotection came from love, even when it went too far, and now we were all learning together how to find balance. Chris nodded slowly, then asked how much longer his grandparents were staying, and I could hear the dread in his voice. Regina insisted on accompanying Diana to her physical therapy appointment that afternoon, and I watched helplessly as my wife tried to protest. Diana said she'd be fine going alone, that I could drive her, but Regina wouldn't hear it. She said Diana clearly needed support and supervision, that she couldn't trust Diana to follow the therapist's instructions properly without someone there to take notes. At the appointment, Regina dominated the conversation with the physical therapist, a woman named Nora Coleman, who'd been great with Diana for weeks. Regina questioned Nora's credentials, asking where she went to the school and how long she'd been practicing and whether she was really qualified to handle Diana's specific injuries. Nora handled it professionally, calmly explaining her background and experience, but I could see the concern in her eyes as she watched Diana shrink in her chair. Regina suggested alternative treatments she'd read about online, expensive experimental therapies that Nora gently explained weren't necessary or appropriate for Diana's recovery. Regina kept interrupting the exercises to ask if Nora was sure this was the right approach, if maybe they should get a second opinion, if Diana should be pushing herself harder or taking it easier. I sat in the corner watching my wife's mental state deteriorate under her mother's constant questioning and criticism, seeing Nora's professional concern grow as Diana stopped speaking up for herself entirely. Johnny cornered me in the garage when I went out to get something from the car, blocking my path back to the house. He started lecturing me about being too soft on Chris, saying boys need discipline and structure, not coddling and comfort. He said Chris should be in military school learning to be a man instead of staying home helping his injured parents like some kind of nurse. He went on about how his generation knew how to raise boys properly, with strict rules and harsh consequences and no room for weakness or emotion. He suggested I was failing as a father by letting Chris cook and clean and do household tasks, saying those were women's jobs, and I was confusing the boy about his role. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood, reminding myself that losing my temper wouldn't help Diana or Chris right now. Johnny kept going, saying Chris needed sports and competition and toughening up, that all this gentle parenting nonsense was creating a generation of weak men who couldn't handle real life. I stood there taking it, my hands clenched into fists in my pockets, thinking about how this man had left his 8-year-old daughter alone for days and was now lecturing me about parenting. That afternoon, Regina reorganized our kitchen cabinets without asking anyone, throwing out half our food and replacing it with her expensive preferences. Chris stood watching silently as his meal planning system got completely destroyed. All the work he'd put into learning where everything goes dismissed as childish and wrong. He tried to explain his system to her, how he'd organize things by meal type and frequency of use, but Regina just patted his head like he was 5 years old. She said, "That's nice, dear," while continuing to rearrange everything according to her own logic, moving the plates to a different cabinet and the glasses to a higher shelf Chris couldn't reach easily. She threw out perfectly good food because it didn't meet her standards, tossing Chris's carefully portioned meal prep containers in the trash and replacing them with her fancy organic ingredients. Chris's hands shook slightly as he watched weeks of his work get undone in minutes. His whole system that had kept our family fed and organized completely dismantled by someone who'd been in our house less than 24 hours. Regina moved on from the kitchen to the living room, where Diana sat on the couch with her legs propped up on pillows. I heard Regina's voice getting louder as she walked around pointing at things. She criticized the paint color on the walls, saying it was too dark and made the room feel small. She picked up one of Diana's decorative pillows and wrinkled her nose, dropping it back on the couch like it was dirty. She moved to the bookshelf and started pulling out books, asking why Diana wasted money on novels instead of educational materials. Diana sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion. Regina noticed the family photos on the wall and started in on those too, saying the frames didn't match and the arrangement looked sloppy. She pointed at our wedding photo and made a comment about Diana's dress being too simple. I watched Diana's breathing get faster and shallower with each criticism. Regina kept going for what felt like forever, moving from the curtains to the furniture to the carpet to the light fixtures. Nothing was good enough. Diana started making small gasping sounds, and I saw her chest heaving. I moved quickly to her side and took her hand. Her pulse was racing under my fingers. I told Regina we needed a moment and helped Diana stand up. She leaned heavily on me as we made our way down the hall to our bedroom. I closed the door behind us and Diana collapsed onto the bed, hyperventilating and crying. I sat beside her and rubbed her back, talking quietly until her breathing slowed down. She kept saying sorry over and over, apologizing for the house not being good enough, for being a disappointment. I stayed with her until she fell asleep from exhaustion. When I came back out to the living room, Chris was sitting with his grandparents looking small and helpless. He fumbled with the TV remote like he didn't know how to use it. He asked Regina in a quiet voice if she could help him make a sandwich, because he wasn't sure where things were anymore. She patted his head and went to the kitchen with him. Johnny grunted something about the boy being useless. I wanted to say something, but Chris caught my eye and gave a tiny shake of his head. Later that night, after his grandparents went to bed, Chris found me in the garage. He told me he'd been playing dumb on purpose, acting like the helpless child they expected to see. He said if they thought he was incompetent, then maybe they'd stop tearing into Diana so hard. He figured if they got what they wanted with him, they might ease up on his mom. I pulled him into a hug and told him he was a good kid, but he shouldn't have to protect his mother from her own parents. The next morning, I woke up early and went to the kitchen to start coffee. I heard voices coming from the living room and recognized Regina's sharp tone. I stopped in the hallway where they couldn't see me. Regina was standing over Diana, who sat hunched on the couch. Regina told Diana she'd thrown away her potential, that she could have been something important instead of just a wife and mother. She said Diana had been accepted to a prestigious university, but chose to get married instead. Regina's voice dripped with disgust as she talked about how Diana ruined everything Regina had planned for her. She said all those years of pushing Diana to excel in the school, all that money spent on tutors and activities, completely wasted. Diana was crying, her voice breaking as she apologized. She said she was sorry for being such a disappointment, sorry for not living up to expectations, sorry for choosing her own path. Regina kept going, listing all the ways Diana had failed to meet her standards. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Chris standing in the hallway. His face had gone completely white and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He stared past me at the scene in the living room, watching his grandmother tear his mother apart with words. His jaw was tight, and I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure rage mixed with something that looked like understanding finally clicking into place. He turned and walked back to his room without saying anything. I followed him and found him sitting on his bed with his head in his hands. He looked up at me and said we had to do something because his grandparents were destroying his mom right in front of us. Chris started pacing his room, running his hands through his hair. He said he finally understood why Diana had held on so tight all these years. She wasn't trying to control him or keep him weak. She was trying to give him the childhood she never had, the safety and protection she desperately needed when she was young. He said his mom had spent 16 years making sure he never felt alone or scared or unwanted like she did. All the overprotection, all the rules, all the hovering, it was Diana's way of being the parent her own parents never were. Chris's voice cracked as he talked about watching his grandmother criticize everything about Diana's life and seeing his mom just take it. He said we couldn't let this keep happening for 5 more days. I agreed we needed to act, but told him we had to be smart about it. If we confronted Johnny and Regina directly, they might dig in harder and make things worse for Diana. We needed a plan that would protect Diana without giving her parents more ammunition to use against her. Chris nodded, and we spent a few minutes talking through options, but before we could decide anything, Johnny appeared in the doorway. He demanded I take him on a tour of the neighborhood so he could see where his grandson was growing up. I didn't want to leave Chris alone with Regina, but Johnny wasn't asking. He was telling. I grabbed my keys and we headed out to the car. Johnny settled into the passenger seat and immediately started criticizing the car's interior. He asked why I didn't drive something newer, something that reflected better on the family. I pulled out of the driveway and started driving slowly through our neighborhood. Johnny looked out the window and made disapproving sounds. He pointed at the houses and said they were too small, too close together, not enough land. He asked about property values and made a face when I told him. We passed the elementary school and he said it looked run down, asking why we hadn't moved to a better district. I told him Chris's school was actually pretty good, but Johnny cut me off. He said good wasn't good enough, that Chris should be in a private academy learning from the best teachers. We drove past the park where Chris used to play, and Johnny asked why there weren't more organized sports facilities. He went on about how boys need structure and competition, not just random playground equipment. Every turn brought new complaints. The grocery store wasn't upscale enough. The library was too small. The neighbors' yards weren't maintained well enough. Johnny told me I clearly wasn't providing adequately for my family, that Diana deserved better than this middle-class suburban life. He said she'd married beneath her potential, and it showed in every aspect of our lives. He went on about how if Diana had married someone from her own social class, someone with real ambition and earning power, she'd be living in a proper house in a proper neighborhood. I gripped the steering wheel tight and kept driving, letting him talk himself out. When we got back to the house, I walked in to find Chris standing in the kitchen staring at the trash can. His face was blank, but his hands were shaking at his sides. I looked in the trash and saw his cookbook sitting on top of the garbage, the one he'd been using to learn recipes and plan meals. Regina stood by the counter with her arms crossed, looking satisfied. She said 16-year-old boys shouldn't be cooking because it was making him soft. She said real men don't spend time in the kitchen doing women's work. Diana tried to speak up from the couch, saying Chris had been doing a great job taking care of us during recovery. Regina spun around and cut her off mid-sentence. She told Diana this was exactly the problem, that Diana clearly didn't know how to raise a proper young man. She said Chris needed discipline and masculine activities, not aprons and recipe cards. She went on about how she was going to fix the damage Diana had done, get Chris back on track to being a real man. Chris still hadn't moved, just stood there staring at his book in the trash. I saw his throat working like he was trying to swallow something down. Regina kept talking about her plans to toughen Chris up, listing all the things she thought he should be doing instead. Diana was crying quietly on the couch, but didn't try to argue anymore. I wanted to pull Chris's book out of the trash and tell Regina exactly what I thought of her opinions, but I remembered what Chris and I had talked about earlier. We needed to be smart. Losing my temper now wouldn't help anyone. The doorbell rang and I went to answer it, grateful for the interruption. Matthew Weber stood on the porch holding a casserole dish. He said he wanted to check in and brought dinner since he knew we were still recovering. I invited him in and watched something remarkable happen. Johnny and Regina completely transformed. Johnny stood up with a warm smile and shook Matthew's hand, asking how he was doing. Regina came over and thanked Matthew for his thoughtfulness, gushing about what a wonderful neighbor he was. She asked about his family and seemed genuinely interested in his answers. Johnny talked about how worried they'd been when they heard about the accident, how they'd rushed right over to help their daughter and grandson. Regina put her arm around Chris and talked about how proud she was of what a capable young man he was becoming. Matthew smiled and said it was clear Chris had a loving family supporting him. Johnny and Regina kept up the performance, playing the role of concerned, doting grandparents perfectly. They asked Matthew about the neighborhood, complimented his yard, talked about community events. It was like watching completely different people. Matthew stayed for about 20 minutes making small talk before saying he needed to get home. The second the door closed behind him, Regina dropped the smile. She set the casserole on the counter and complained about having to pretend to care what the neighbors thought. Johnny went back to his chair and turned on the TV without another word. Chris stared at them both with this look of dawning realization. Later, when I was helping him with something in his room, he told me the performance explained so much. He said that's why nobody believed Diana when she was young and tried to tell people about her home life. Her parents probably acted like model citizens in public while being completely different behind closed doors. He said watching them switch it on and off so easily was one of the creepiest things he'd ever seen. That night, I went looking for Diana and found her in our bedroom surrounded by old photo albums. Pictures were spread across the bed and she was crying over them. I sat down beside her and looked at the photos. Every single one showed a young Diana alone. School pictures where she looked uncomfortable in clothes that didn't fit right. Birthday photos with no other kids around. Holiday pictures where she stood by herself in front of a tree. In every image, she looked scared and small and like she was trying to disappear. Diana picked up one photo of herself at maybe 9 years old, wearing a stained shirt and standing in what looked like an empty kitchen. She told me she'd tried so hard to be different with Chris. She wanted to give him everything she never had, make him feel safe and loved and protected every single second. She said maybe she went too far the other way, swinging from neglect to overprotection without finding the middle ground. I put my arm around her and told her she'd loved Chris the best way she knew how. She'd kept him safe and made sure he never felt alone or unwanted. Now we were all learning better together, finding the balance between protection and independence. Diana leaned against me and cried harder, saying she didn't know how to stand up to her parents. She'd spent 18 years being told she was worthless and incompetent. Even now, as an adult with her own family, she still felt like that scared little girl when they were around. I held her and told her she was stronger than she thought, that she'd already survived the worst they could do to her. The next morning, Regina announced at breakfast that she'd be taking over Chris's education. She said Diana clearly couldn't manage homeschooling from the couch, and Chris needed proper academic structure. Chris's eyes shot to mine across the table, wide with panic. Regina pulled out a notebook and started planning a schedule, talking about rigorous academics and strict discipline. She said Chris would study from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon with short breaks. She listed subjects and said she'd be testing him daily to make sure he was actually learning. Diana tried to interrupt, saying Chris was doing fine in his regular school and would be going back once we were recovered. Regina waved her hand dismissively and said this was more evidence of Diana's permissive parenting. She told Diana that public school wasn't challenging enough for a boy Chris's age, that he needed private tutoring and advanced coursework. Johnny nodded along from his chair, saying the boy clearly hadn't been pushed hard enough. Regina kept planning out loud, talking about discipline and consequences for not meeting her standards. Chris looked like he might throw up. Diana tried again to protest, but her voice was weak and shaky. Regina just talked over her, saying she'd already made up her mind and would be starting Chris's new schedule tomorrow morning. I'd been biting my tongue for 2 days, but watching Regina dismiss Diana's concerns while planning to take over Chris's life made something snap inside me. Regina started in on Diana again, saying she was being weak and dramatic just like when she was a child. She told Diana to stop crying and act like an adult for once. I stood up and my chair scraped loudly against the floor. I told Regina that Diana was recovering from a serious accident and didn't need this stress. I said maybe they should consider cutting their visit short, since they clearly weren't helping the situation. The room went completely silent. Diana stared at me with wide eyes. Chris froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Regina's mouth fell open like I'd said something in a foreign language. Johnny slowly stood up from his chair, his face turning red. I realized in that moment that no one had ever challenged them before. Diana had been too scared as a child and too traumatized as an adult. Everyone else in their lives probably saw the public performance and never witnessed the private cruelty. I'd just broken an unspoken rule that had been in place for decades. Johnny walked over to me and got right in my face, close enough that I could smell his cologne. He told me I had no right to speak to his wife that way. He said they were here to help their incompetent daughter, who clearly couldn't manage her own household. His voice was low and threatening as he listed all the ways Diana had failed, all the evidence that she needed their guidance and control. I stood my ground even though my heart was pounding. I looked him in the eye and said Diana was one of the most capable people I knew. I said she was an amazing mother and wife, and the only reason she doubted herself was because they'd spent 18 years tearing her down. I told him they'd left an 8-year-old child to raise herself, and then had the nerve to criticize how she turned out. Regina gasped like I'd physically slapped her. She clutched at her chest and made wounded sounds. Johnny's face went from red to purple. Diana sat frozen on the couch staring at me with an expression of complete terror mixed with something that might have been hope. Johnny's face went from purple to almost black. He stepped closer and jabbed his finger toward my chest. He said if we didn't appreciate their help, maybe they should take Chris back with them where he'd learn proper discipline. He said Diana was clearly an unfit mother raising a weak, coddled boy who'd never survive in the real world. His voice got louder with each word, filling the whole room. That's when Chris walked in from the hallway. He must have heard everything. He stood in the doorway looking at his grandfather with this calm expression. He said quietly that he wasn't weak. Regina actually laughed. It was this high, mean sound. She asked what he could possibly do to prove otherwise. She looked at Johnny like they were sharing a private joke about how pathetic Chris was. I watched Chris's face change. Something shifted in his eyes. He wasn't scared or hurt. He looked determined. Chris walked past all of us straight into the kitchen. I heard a drawer open. Regina and Johnny followed him, and Diana struggled to sit up straighter on the couch to see. Chris pulled out the big chef's knife from the block. Regina made this gasping sound. Chris set it on the cutting board and opened the fridge. He pulled out vegetables and set them on the counter in a neat line. He tied on an apron and started washing his hands at the sink. His movements were smooth and sure. Regina and Johnny stood frozen in the kitchen doorway watching. Chris picked up the knife and started dicing an onion. His technique was perfect. He kept his fingers curled back and moved the blade in a steady rhythm. He explained out loud that you always use a sharp knife because dull ones slip. He said you cut away from yourself and keep your workspace clean. Regina suddenly rushed forward. She reached for the knife, saying he'd hurt himself. Chris smoothly stepped to the side without looking up. He kept chopping. He moved to the celery next, explaining how to cut it into even pieces for a proper dice. Johnny's voice came out rough. He demanded to know who taught Chris these things. Chris set down the knife and looked his grandfather straight in the eye. He said Dad did it because Dad trusts him to learn and grow instead of treating him like he's made of glass. Chris explained about the months of secret lessons while Diana was at book club or physical therapy. He talked about learning to cook, do laundry, basic repairs, managing money. He said he'd made mistakes and learned from them. Diana sat on the couch with her hand covering her mouth. Her eyes were huge. She looked torn between pride and absolute fear of what her parents would say. Regina spun away from Chris and marched over to Diana. Her face was twisted with fury. She started listing everything that could have gone wrong. Burns, cuts, fires, accidents, disasters. She said Diana had neglected Chris by allowing him to be put in danger. She said this proved Diana was as incompetent as Regina always knew she was. She said Diana couldn't be trusted with basic parenting decisions. Diana started crying. She said she was sorry. She said she should have been more careful. She fell right back into those old patterns, apologizing for existing. I saw Chris's face harden. He set the knife down carefully and wiped his hands on the apron. He walked over to where Diana sat on the couch. He knelt down beside her so they were at eye level. He took both her hands in his. He told her she was the best mom he could have asked for. He said she loved him so much she almost loved him too hard, but that was okay because now they were both learning balance together. He said she kept him safe when he needed it, and now she was learning to let him grow. Diana stared at her son like she'd never seen him before. This confident young man who understood her so completely, who saw her fears and loved her anyway. Tears ran down Diana's face, but she wasn't sobbing anymore. She looked at her parents standing in our living room. Her voice shook, but she said they needed to leave. Regina laughed. She said Diana couldn't possibly manage without their help. Diana said louder that they needed to leave her house. Johnny started to argue. Diana cut him off. She said she spent 18 years being told she was worthless. She said she wouldn't let them do the same thing to Chris. Regina's expression changed completely. She suddenly looked sweet and concerned. She said Diana clearly wasn't thinking straight because of the pain medication. She reached out for Diana's hand. Diana pulled away. She said she was thinking more clearly than she had in years. She said she tried so hard to be a perfect mother because she never wanted Chris to feel the way they made her feel. Alone and scared and convinced she was broken. Johnny pulled out his phone. He said he was calling Child Protective Services. He said Diana and I were endangering Chris by letting him use knives and stoves. Chris actually laughed. He pulled out his own phone and started swiping through it. He turned the screen toward his grandparents. It showed video after video of him cooking. Careful technique, growing confidence, no injuries. Chris said the only danger to him was growing up thinking he was too fragile to handle normal life. Diana's voice got stronger. She started telling stories Chris and I had never heard. Being locked in her room for days as punishment. Having to steal food from the cafeteria at the school because there was nothing at home. Wearing the same clothes for weeks because no one taught her to do laundry. Regina tried to interrupt, but Diana kept talking. Years of suppressed truth poured out of her. She said she forgave them for being terrible parents, but she wouldn't let them be terrible grandparents too. Regina broke down crying. She said Diana was being cruel and unfair. She said they did their best with limited resources. Diana said quietly that having money for luxury cars and expensive ingredients now proved they had resources back then. They just chose not to use them on her. Johnny grabbed Regina's arm. He said they were leaving. He said Diana was clearly ungrateful and they wouldn't stay where they weren't appreciated. Chris moved to block the doorway before Johnny could take another step. He stood there with his shoulders back and his chin up in a way I'd never seen before. He looked at his grandparents and started talking in this calm, steady voice that didn't sound like my 16-year-old son at all. He said his mom spent his whole life trying to protect him from feeling unwanted. He said he was grateful for that even if she went overboard sometimes. He said he wasn't weak or coddled like they thought. He said he was loved and there was a huge difference between those things. Johnny's face went red, and he tried to push past Chris toward the door. I stepped up beside my son, and together we formed a wall they couldn't get through. I pulled out my phone and told them they could leave peacefully right now, or I'd call the police and have them removed for trespassing. Regina started sputtering about family loyalty and respect, and how dare we treat them this way. Diana's voice came from behind us on the couch. She said respect goes both ways, and they never respected her. Regina's expression changed completely. Tears started running down her face, and she turned to Chris with her hands out. She said she only wanted what was best for him. She said she loved him so much and just wanted to help. Chris looked at her without moving. He said if this was what her love looked like, then he didn't want it. The words hit Regina like I'd punched her in the stomach. Her mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. I watched her face crumble as she realized she'd lost. Johnny grabbed Regina's arm and pulled her toward the stairs. He said they'd get their things and leave since we clearly didn't appreciate anything they tried to do. The two of them stomped upstairs and we heard drawers slamming and suitcases being thrown around. Diana sat on the couch holding Chris's hand on one side and mine on the other. Her whole body was shaking, but she didn't look away from the stairs. When Johnny and Regina came back down with their luggage, Regina tried one more time. She said we were abandoning family and we'd regret this someday. Diana's voice was quiet but steady. She said Regina abandoned her first when she was 8 years old and she survived. She said she'd survive this too. We all stood at the living room window and watched Johnny load their bags into the luxury car. Regina got in the passenger seat without looking back at the house. The car pulled away and disappeared down the street. Diana collapsed into sobs, but they weren't sad crying. Her whole body shook like something was pouring out of her. Chris and I held her from both sides while she cried and cried. I kept telling her she was safe now. I said she was free and she did the impossible thing. That night, Diana couldn't sleep. She kept tossing and turning next to me in bed. One minute she'd say she felt relieved, and the next she'd say she made a terrible mistake. I reminded her that protecting Chris from toxic people wasn't a mistake. I said it was good parenting. Around midnight, our bedroom door opened and Chris came in wearing his old pajamas. He crawled into bed between us like he used to do when he was little. We all held each other in the dark without talking. The next morning, I woke up to find Diana reaching for her phone on the nightstand. Her hands were shaking as she started to dial. I gently took the phone away and asked what she was doing. She said she needed to call her parents and apologize. I reminded her why they had to leave. I reminded her what they were doing to her and to Chris. She started crying, but she nodded. She said she couldn't go back to that pattern even though breaking it felt like tearing off her own skin. Chris came into our room and said he was making breakfast. He disappeared downstairs and we heard him moving around in the kitchen. Diana and I got up and made our way down slowly with our injuries. Chris was putting things back where they belonged after Regina reorganized everything. He talked while he cooked about understanding his mom better now. He said he got how fear can make you hold on too tight to the people you love. Diana watched him from her spot at the table with this look on her face. Pride mixed with pain. She was seeing her son's grown-up thinking and also remembering all the childhood fears that shaped how she raised him. The doorbell rang right after we finished eating. Nora came in for Diana's home physical therapy session. She looked around and said something felt different in the house. Diana broke down and told her everything. The whole story about her parents visiting and the confrontation and the years of trauma that made her overprotect Chris. Nora listened without interrupting, and then she said something that surprised me. She suggested Diana might benefit from talking to someone professional about her childhood experiences. Diana pulled back and said she should be strong enough to handle this on her own. Chris looked up from loading the dishwasher. He said going to physical therapy for her broken legs didn't make her weak. He asked why therapy for her emotional injuries would be any different. I watched my wife and son have this honest conversation about mental health and healing. Diana was crying, but she was listening. Chris was being so gentle and mature about it. I felt so proud of both of them I could barely stand it. Over the next few days, Diana moved through the house like someone learning to walk on new legs. Some mornings, she woke up smiling and made it all the way through breakfast without crying. Other mornings, she stayed in bed until noon, staring at the ceiling. I watched her cycle through emotions faster than I could track. She'd laugh at something Chris said, then burst into tears 5 minutes later. Wednesday afternoon, she found Chris doing laundry and just stood in the doorway watching him fold towels. Her hands twisted together, and she opened her mouth twice before any words came out. She apologized for the booster seat first, her voice so quiet I almost missed it from where I stood in the hallway. Then she apologized for walking him to class every day until he was 14, for the hard hat, for cutting his food, for treating him like he'd shatter if the wind blew too hard. Chris dropped the towel he was holding and wrapped his arms around her. He told her he knew she was trying to keep him safe. Diana sobbed into his shoulder while he held her steady, this kid who'd grown up so much in just a few months. Chris said they'd figure out the balance together, and Diana nodded against his chest like she was clinging to those words. Matthew Weber showed up Friday afternoon with groceries we didn't ask for. He walked into the kitchen and stopped, looking around like he was seeing the place for the first time. He said something felt different, lighter somehow. The air didn't feel so heavy. Diana was sitting at the table with her legs propped up, and she gave him a small smile. She told him a simple version of what happened with her parents, leaving out the worst parts. Matthew set the grocery bags on the counter and pulled out a chair. He sat down and told Diana he cut off his own toxic family members about 10 years ago. His brother kept borrowing money and never paying it back. His mother kept guilt-tripping him about not visiting enough, even though she lived 2 hours away. Matthew said he spent years thinking he was a bad person for wanting distance. Then one day his therapist told him that choosing peace over obligation wasn't selfish. It was survival. Diana's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. She asked how he knew it was the right choice. Matthew said he slept through the night for the first time in years after he made the decision. That was how he knew. Monday morning, Diana picked up her phone and stared at it for 20 minutes before doing anything. Her hands shook so bad she almost dropped it twice. I sat down beside her and took her free hand in mine. She looked at me with this expression like she was about to jump off a cliff. Then she dialed. The therapist's receptionist answered, and Diana's voice came out all wobbly when she explained she needed help processing childhood trauma. She said she needed to learn healthier parenting strategies because she'd been doing everything wrong. I squeezed her hand and she squeezed back hard enough to hurt. The receptionist asked a few questions, and Diana answered them while tears ran down her face. The therapist had an opening next Tuesday at 3. Diana said yes and thanked her 3 times before hanging up. She set the phone down on the table and covered her face with both hands. I asked if she was okay, and she nodded without uncovering her face. She said she was terrified but also relieved, like she'd been carrying something heavy for so long she forgot what it felt like to put it down. That afternoon, Chris's school counselor called. Jacob Fields introduced himself and said he was checking in because Chris had missed some assignments during the past couple weeks. Chris took the phone and explained about his grandparents visiting and the whole situation that happened. His voice stayed calm and clear while he talked, not embarrassed or defensive. Jacob listened without interrupting, and then offered to meet with our whole family if we wanted support navigating these changes. Chris looked at Diana and me with raised eyebrows, silently asking what we thought. Diana surprised me by saying yes before I could even open my mouth. She said we could use help figuring this out together. Jacob said he'd send over some scheduling options, and Chris thanked him. After Chris hung up, Diana looked at me and said she never thought she'd be the kind of person who asked for help. I told her asking for help was the bravest thing she'd ever done. That evening, the three of us sat in the living room with all the lights on. Diana was on the couch with her legs elevated, Chris was in the armchair, and I was on the floor leaning against the wall because my back still hurt if I sat too long. We talked for almost 3 hours about things we'd never said out loud before. Diana told Chris stories about her childhood that made him go pale. Being 8 years old and cooking hot dogs on a hot plate because her parents were gone for 4 days. Wearing the same jeans to the school for 2 weeks straight because nobody taught her how to use a washing machine. Enrolling herself in middle school because her parents forgot. Chris asked why she never told him any of this before, and Diana said she was ashamed. She thought if she never talked about it, then maybe it didn't really happen. I admitted that I'd enabled her overprotection because I was scared of fighting with her. I said I took the easy road by going behind her back instead of having hard conversations. Chris talked about needing age-appropriate independence and how suffocating it felt to be treated like a baby. Diana cried through most of the conversation, but she didn't shut down or change the subject. She listened and nodded and asked questions. Chris was so mature and compassionate about the whole thing. He never got angry or blamed her even when he had every right to. I watched my son handle this heavy conversation with more grace than most adults could manage. Diana's first therapy session happened over video call on Tuesday since she still couldn't drive. She set up her laptop in our bedroom and closed the door. The session lasted 50 minutes, and when she came out, she looked completely drained. Her eyes were red and puffy, her hair was a mess from running her hands through it, and she moved slowly like her whole body ached. But she was smiling a little bit. She told us the therapist validated her feelings about her parents and explained how childhood neglect often leads to overprotective parenting. Diana said just having a name for the pattern made her feel less crazy. She'd spent years thinking something was wrong with her, that she was broken somehow. The therapist told her she wasn't broken, she was traumatized, and there was a difference. Diana cried again when she told us this, but it was a different kind of crying. Not the desperate sobbing from before, but something quieter and almost relieved. She said she had homework to do before the next session, worksheets about identifying anxiety triggers and developing coping strategies. Wednesday evening, we sat down together and made a list of new family rules. Chris got a notebook and wrote everything down while we talked. Diana said Chris could have more independence, but he needed to check in regularly so she wouldn't spiral into panic. Chris agreed and said he understood that building trust took time. I promised to speak up when I disagreed with something, instead of going behind Diana's back. Diana promised to work on managing her anxiety instead of controlling Chris's environment. We spent an hour hashing out details and compromises. Chris could cook dinner 3 nights a week, but Diana needed to know the menu ahead of time. Chris could do his own laundry, but Diana wanted to see that he was doing it correctly at first. Chris could hang out with friends, but he needed to text when he got there and when he was leaving. We wrote everything down in clear, simple language, and then Chris tore the page out of the notebook. We walked to the kitchen together, and Diana taped it to the fridge with 4 magnets, 1 in each corner. She stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. Then she said it felt real now, seeing it written down like that. A visible commitment to change. Thursday morning, Chris asked if he could start studying for his driver's permit now that things were calmer. Diana's whole body went rigid, and her mouth opened to say no. I watched her catch herself mid-breath. She closed her mouth and took 3 deep breaths like her therapist had taught her. Then she said she needed to think about it instead of giving an automatic refusal. Chris's face lit up with the biggest smile I'd seen in weeks. He told her that was progress, and Diana laughed through fresh tears. She said it felt like progress too, even though every cell in her body was screaming to say no and lock him in his room forever. Chris hugged her and said he knew this was hard for her. Diana held onto him tight and said she was trying so hard to let go without letting go completely. The neighbor stopped by Friday with more groceries. She mentioned seeing Diana's parents leaving earlier in the week and asked if everything was okay. Diana paused with a bag of apples in her hand. Then she said honestly that it was better than okay. She explained that sometimes you have to remove toxic people from your life, even if they're family. The neighbor nodded and said she did the same thing with her sister about 5 years ago. Her sister kept stirring up drama at every family gathering and making everyone miserable. The neighbor said cutting her off was the hardest decision she ever made, but also the most peaceful. Diana thanked her for sharing that, and the neighbor squeezed her shoulder before leaving. Saturday afternoon, Diana was reading on the couch when Chris started making dinner. She heard the knife hitting the cutting board, and her head snapped up. She was on her feet before I could even register what was happening, moving faster than she should with her injuries. She grabbed the knife out of Chris's hand mid-chop and held it away from him. Chris stood there with his hands up, looking startled. Then he said her name gently and reminded her of their new agreement. Diana froze with the knife in her hand, her chest heaving. She looked at Chris, then at me, then back at Chris. She forced herself to give him the knife back and took 2 steps backward. Her hands were shaking and she wrapped her arms around herself like she was physically holding herself back. Chris went back to chopping vegetables and Diana watched with her jaw clenched tight. I could see her fighting every instinct to rush over and take the knife away again. She stayed where she was, though, breathing hard and blinking back tears. Chris finished chopping safely, and Diana let out a long, shaky breath. I watched her learning to trust in real time, one terrifying moment at a time. 2 weeks passed with Diana working through therapy sessions and slowly releasing her grip on every aspect of Chris's life. She still had moments where the old panic took over, but they got shorter each time. One evening after dinner, Chris cleared the table and left us alone in the living room. Diana turned to me with tired eyes and said she knew she went too far trying to keep Chris safe. Her voice shook when she admitted she was scared of swinging too far the other way now, of becoming careless or neglectful like her own parents. I took her hand and told her we would make mistakes figuring this out, but we would make them together while actually talking to each other instead of hiding things. She nodded and squeezed my hand tight, saying that felt like something she could do. The next evening, Diana picked up her phone and stared at it for 10 minutes before finally dialing her parents' number. I sat beside her as she told them calmly that she needed space to work on herself and her family. Regina's voice came through the speaker sharp and angry, trying every guilt trip she knew. Diana's whole body shook, but she held firm and said she would reach out when and if she was ready. She hung up and immediately the phone started ringing again. Diana stared at the screen showing her mother's name flashing over and over. She turned the phone off completely and set it face down on the coffee table. Her hands trembled for a good 5 minutes afterward, but she did not turn the phone back on or give in to the urge to call back and apologize. Chris came downstairs later and saw the phone still sitting there dark and silent. He hugged his mom without saying anything, and she held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. The following week, Chris passed his driver's permit test on the first try. Diana managed her anxiety by agreeing to go with him to practice driving in empty parking lots on Sunday mornings. That first Sunday, she climbed into the passenger seat and gripped the door handle so hard her knuckles turned white. Chris adjusted the mirrors and seat exactly like I taught him, checking everything twice before starting the engine. Diana pressed her feet into the floor like she could brake from the passenger side. Chris drove slowly around the empty lot, turning carefully and stopping smoothly at imaginary stop signs. Diana did not tell him to stop or take over, even though I could see her jaw clenched tight the whole time. After 20 minutes, Chris parked and turned off the engine. Diana let out a long, shaky breath and admitted it was scary watching him, but also kind of great seeing him learn and grow. Chris grinned and said that was huge progress for her. Our physical recovery reached the 6-week mark, and the doctor cleared us both to start moving around more normally. Diana joked that now she had no excuse to avoid doing things herself. Chris shot back that he was not going back to booster seats no matter what. The laughter that followed felt real and light, like we were finally becoming the family we should have been all along. A few days later, Jacob Fields came to our house for a family meeting. He helped us create strategies for managing Diana's anxiety when it spiked and supporting Chris's growing independence without leaving him completely on his own. Jacob praised the progress we made in such a short time and reminded us that healing was not a straight line. There would be good days and hard days and sometimes really bad days mixed in. Diana cried but nodded, accepting that this was a journey without a clear endpoint. Jacob gave us worksheets and breathing exercises and a plan for checking in with each other when things got tough. He said the fact that we were all willing to work together meant we were already halfway there. 3 months after the accident, Chris got his driver's license and asked if he could drive himself to the school. Diana's immediate reaction was panic, but she caught herself and took 3 deep breaths before saying yes. That first morning, Diana and I stood on the porch watching Chris load his backpack into the car. Diana was crying but smiling at the same time, holding my hand so tight I lost feeling in my fingers. Chris backed carefully out of the driveway exactly like I taught him, checking his mirrors and turning his head to look for obstacles. He waved at us through the window before driving away down the street, confident and capable, and finally free to be the young man he was becoming. Diana whispered that we did it. We were actually letting him grow up. I kissed her temple and said we were all growing up together. For the first time in years, our family felt whole and healthy and real, built on trust instead of fear and love that made space for independence instead of crushing it.